The dry Texas wind swept through the crowded auction barn, carrying whispers and stifled laughter from men in polished boots and tailored suits. All eyes occasionally drifted to one horse that no one seemed interested in, a quarter horse with a coat like molten copper, gleaming faintly under the dim lighting. But his frame was too thin, his posture too weary. The auctioneer's voice cracked through the heavy air, trying desperately to spark interest. "All right, folks, who'll start us off? 5,000? No. How about 3? His words hung unanswered, like an echo in an empty canyon. Joe Callahan leaned quietly against the far wall, his rough hands buried in the pockets of his worn shirt. He hadn't come to buy anything. He barely had enough money to keep his family fed for the week. But something about the horse kept pulling at him. Those eyes, they weren't just the eyes of an animal. They told a story of hardship, rejection, and quiet resilience. Joe felt his chest tighten. They were the same eyes he saw every morning in the mirror. "That nag isn't worth the hay it eats," a sharply dressed man muttered nearby, eliciting chuckles from others. Joe ignored the taunts, but the words stung. His farm was hanging by a thread. Years of failed harvests and mounting debts had left him with nothing but a battered truck, a crumbling barn, and an endless ache of failure. His wife, Clara, had begged him to sell what little was left before they lost it all. He knew buying a horse, especially this horse, was a reckless, impossible idea. And yet, when no one else raised their hand, Joe did. The room fell silent. Heads turned. A few muffled snickers broke the quiet. "Joe Callahan," the auctioneer said, his eyebrows raised. "Haven't seen you bid in a decade. You sure about this?" Joe nodded stiffly, ignoring the heat rising in his face. He handed over the last cash he had, every dollar scraped together over weeks of desperation. As the horse was led to him, someone whispered just loud enough for Joe to hear, "He won't last a month, and neither will that fool's farm." That night, under the pale light of the moon, Joe stood by the horse in the ramshackle barn he called home. The animal's breath was slow and uneven, his ribs faintly visible. Joe reached out, his hand trembling as he touched the horse's neck. "They don't see what you're capable of," he murmured, his voice hoarse. "But I do. You and me, we're gonna prove them all wrong." The horse's tired eyes flickered, catching a sliver of light, and for the first time in years, Joe felt a spark of something he thought he'd lost forever: hope. Hook ending. What Joe couldn't know was that this single act of desperation would set into motion a series of events that would challenge everything he thought he knew about resilience, redemption, and the power of second chances. The first morning with the horse felt like waking up to a mistake Joe couldn't undo. The animal stood in the corner of the small barn, barely moving, his ribs showing with every slow breath. Joe had spent the last of his savings at the auction. Now, as he tossed a handful of hay into the stall, he realized he had no idea how to fix what he'd gotten himself into. The horse, who still didn't have a name, barely acknowledged the food. Joe leaned on the wooden gate, his voice breaking the silence. "You and me, we're starting at rock bottom, huh?" The horse's ears flicked slightly, a small gesture that hinted at life still buried beneath his defeated frame. Joe's wife, Clara, appeared at the barn door, her arms crossed, a look of worry etched deep on her face. "You spent everything on him?" she asked quietly, not with anger, but with the kind of disbelief that comes from years of disappointment. Joe didn't meet her gaze. "He's got potential," he said, more to himself than to her. Clara sighed and stepped closer, her voice softening. "Joe, we can barely feed ourselves. What are you gonna do with him?" He didn't answer. Instead, he watched the horse, feeling the same pull he'd felt at the auction. He didn't know how, but something told him this horse was more than just a gamble. The next few days were grueling. Joe worked tirelessly, patching up the old barn, clearing weeds from the overgrown pastures, and finding scraps of feed wherever he could. The horse was skittish, shying away every time Joe tried to get close. It was clear he'd been mistreated before. Joe's hands were blistered, his back ached, and every night he collapsed into bed, feeling the weight of failure pressing harder on his chest. Clara watched him silently, her worry growing. "You're breaking yourself for a horse that doesn't trust you," she said one night, but Joe just shook his head. "I've got to try," he whispered. One morning, after hours of patient coaxing, something shifted. Joe approached the horse slowly, holding out an apple he'd managed to find. The horse hesitated, his nostrils flaring as he sniffed the air. For a long moment, it seemed he would bolt again, but then he took a cautious step forward. Joe held his breath as the horse's soft muzzle brushed against his palm, taking the apple. "There you go, boy," Joe murmured, his voice trembling with relief. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental. For the first time, he saw a flicker of trust in the animal's eyes. But that night, as Joe lay awake, he couldn't shake the voices from the auction, the laughter, the whispers that called him a fool. And in the darkness, he began to wonder if they were right. Was this horse really worth all the sacrifices? Or was he clinging to a dream that would only drag him and his family further into ruin? As doubts crept into his mind, the sound of hooves shuffling in the barn reminded him that the fight had only just begun. What Joe didn't realize was that earning the horse's trust was only the first step. The true test was still to come, and it would push him to the very edge of what he thought he could endure. The days turned into weeks, and the fragile bond between Joe and the horse began to strengthen. The animal, now named Rusty for his fiery coat, followed Joe around the paddock with cautious curiosity. Each small breakthrough, letting Joe touch his mane, standing still for a halter, felt like a step toward something bigger. But as Rusty's trust grew, so did the weight of Joe's uncertainty. The farm's debts were still looming, and Clara's silent stares at the pile of unpaid bills were a constant reminder of the clock ticking against them. One afternoon, while grooming Rusty in the barn, Joe noticed scars along the horse's flank. Thin, pale lines crisscrossed his coat, almost invisible unless you looked closely. Joe's heart sank. "What did they do to you, boy?" he whispered, running his fingers gently over the marks. Rusty flinched but didn't pull away completely. Joe's jaw tightened. Whoever had owned Rusty before hadn't just neglected him, they'd broken him. And yet, here he was, still standing, still fighting. Joe felt a pang of kinship. Maybe that's why he couldn't walk away from this horse. Rusty's resilience mirrored his own. Later that evening, Clara finally spoke what had been weighing on her mind. "Joe, you can't save everything," she said quietly, sitting beside him on the porch as the sun dipped below the horizon. "Sometimes, you have to let go." Joe didn't answer right away. His eyes were fixed on the paddock, where Rusty was grazing under the fading light. "Letting go hasn't worked for us, Clara," he said finally. "I've let go of crops, of equipment, of hope. This horse? I'm not letting go of him." His voice was firm, but his hands trembled as he gripped the railing. The tension in the air was heavy, but Clara didn't argue. Instead, she reached into her pocket and handed him a folded envelope. Joe opened it cautiously, his stomach twisting. It was a foreclosure notice for the farm. "We have 30 days, Joe," Clara said softly, tears brimming in her eyes. Joe stared at the paper, his chest tightening as if the weight of the world was pressing down on him. Rusty had given him a sliver of hope, but this was a reminder of the harsh reality they couldn't escape. That night, unable to sleep, Joe walked out to the barn. Rusty's ears perked up as Joe approached, and for a moment, the horse's steady presence eased the storm in Joe's mind. He placed a hand on Rusty's neck, the warmth grounding him. "I don't know if we can do this," Joe admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "But if you're willing to fight, so am I." Rusty let out a soft exhale, his breath visible in the cool night air. It wasn't a promise, but it was enough. What Joe didn't realize was that the shadows of Rusty's past would soon come back to haunt them both, threatening to unravel the fragile progress they'd made. The morning started like any other. Joe was up before sunrise, patching the sagging fence around the paddock while Rusty wandered nearby. Clara brought out a cup of coffee, setting it silently on the post. Words between them had become scarce, replaced by the heavy weight of their shared worries. Joe gave her a nod, but before he could say anything, the distant sound of tires crunching gravel made them both turn toward the driveway. A sleek black truck rolled up, its polished surface gleaming in the sunlight. A man stepped out, dressed sharply in a crisp button-up shirt and cowboy boots that looked like they'd never touched dirt. Joe recognized him immediately. Cal Whitmore, one of the bidders from the auction. His presence sent a chill down Joe's spine. "Morning," Cal said, tipping his hat, his smile thin and calculating. "I heard through the grapevine you bought that sorry excuse for a horse." His eyes shifted to Rusty, narrowing as he took in the animal's improved condition. "Guess you've been feeding him better than most." Joe didn't respond right away, wiping the sweat from his brow and standing firm. "What brings you all the way out here?" he asked, his voice calm but guarded. Cal's smile widened as he took a slow step closer. "Let's just say I have a vested interest in that horse." Joe's heart skipped. He didn't like where this was going. "That horse isn't for sale," Joe said firmly. Rusty, as if sensing the tension, let out a low snort and moved closer to the fence, his ears pinned back. Cal chuckled, shaking his head. "See, that's where you're mistaken," he said, his tone growing sharper. "Rusty belonged to my ranch before he ended up at that auction. And I think you'll find I've got the paperwork to prove it." He reached into his truck, pulling out a folder and holding it up like a weapon. Joe's stomach twisted. This wasn't just a visit. Cal wanted Rusty back. Clara stepped forward, her voice trembling. "You didn't want him at the auction. Why now?" Cal's eyes flicked to her, then back to Joe. "Because now he's worth something." Joe felt a swell of anger rise in his chest. "He's not going anywhere," he said, his voice hard. "You didn't care about him when he was starving and broken. You don't get to decide he's valuable now." Cal's smile faded, replaced by a cold, calculating glare. "We'll see about that," he said before turning on his heel and climbing back into his truck. The roar of the engine faded as he drove off, but the weight of his threat lingered in the air. Joe clenched his fists, staring at Rusty. "No one's taking you," he muttered under his breath, but the seed of fear had already been planted. As the shadow of Cal Whitmore loomed over them, Joe began to realize that saving Rusty would mean more than just earning his trust. It would mean protecting him from those who had no intention of letting go. The following days were filled with unease. Joe couldn't shake the image of Cal Whitmore standing in his driveway, holding those papers like a threat. Every time he looked at Rusty, now grazing peacefully in the paddock, a knot tightened in his chest. Clara tried to reassure him. "Maybe he's bluffing," she said one night at the dinner table, though her tone was uncertain. Joe simply shook his head. "Men like him don't bluff. They take." He pushed his plate away, the food untouched, and went outside to check on Rusty. In the barn, the quiet was almost comforting. Joe leaned against the stall, watching Rusty sleep. The horse's chest rose and fell steadily, his once guarded demeanor slowly transforming into something calmer, something freer. But Joe's thoughts were anything but calm. If Cal returned with legal backing, or worse, with men to take Rusty by force, what could he do? He had no money for lawyers, no power to fight back. Yet the thought of losing Rusty, after everything they'd been through, felt like another crack in a life already teetering on the edge. The storm hit that night, not just the one brewing in Joe's mind, but a literal storm that rolled in with thunder and sheets of rain. Joe woke to the sound of the wind howling and branches snapping outside. He rushed to the barn, heart pounding as he threw on a jacket. Rusty was pacing nervously in his stall, his eyes wide with fear. "It's okay, boy," Joe whispered, stepping inside to calm him. The roof groaned under the force of the wind, and Joe prayed the old structure would hold. As the storm raged on, Headlights suddenly cut through the rain. Joe froze, his pulse quickening as he saw a truck pull into the driveway. He didn't need to guess who it was. Grabbing an old shotgun that hadn't been fired in years, he stepped out into the downpour. The figure that emerged from the truck confirmed his worst fears. It was Cal Whitmore, this time flanked by 2 ranch hands. "Evening, Callahan," Cal shouted over the rain, his grin sinister. "Figured I'd come by and settle this once and for all." OE stood firm, the rain soaking him to the bone, the shotgun gripped tightly in his hands. "You're not taking him," Joe growled, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. Cal's grin faded, and he took a step closer, unfazed by the weapon. "That's where you're wrong," he said, his tone low and menacing. "I always get what's mine." Behind him, the ranch hands moved toward the barn. Joe's heart raced as he realized this wasn't a negotiation, it was a raid. The storm outside was nothing compared to the battle about to erupt, a battle that would test Joe's courage, his resilience, and just how far he was willing to go to protect the one thing he still had left. The rain was relentless, pounding against the ground and the sagging barn roof as Joe squared his shoulders. His fingers tightened around the shotgun, though he knew it was little more than a bluff. The rusted weapon hadn't fired in years, and he wasn't even sure if it could. Still, it was enough to make Cal pause, his eyes narrowing as thunder cracked across the sky. "This isn't how you want to play it, Callahan," Cal called out, his voice cutting through the storm. "I'm giving you one chance to back down." Joe stepped forward, the mud sucking at his boots, and pointed the barrel toward the ranch hands creeping toward the barn. "You don't scare me, Whitmore," he said, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at his chest. "You come any closer to that barn, and I swear to God, you'll regret it." Cal smirked, as if he didn't believe a word Joe said. "You're bluffing," he said with a dismissive wave of his hand. But as his men hesitated, glancing at the gun, Cal's confidence faltered for the first time. Inside the barn, Rusty was in a frenzy. The storm had him spooked, and the shouting only made it worse. The horse reared, slamming his hooves against the stall door, and let out a panicked whinny that cut through the night. Joe risked a glance back, his heart sinking at the sight of Rusty's wild fear. "Easy, boy," he muttered under his breath, though he didn't dare lower the shotgun. "I won't let them touch you." As the standoff dragged on, the storm seemed to take sides. A fierce gust of wind sent debris flying, and one of the ranch hands stumbled back, shielding his face. The distraction gave Joe just enough time to act. "Get off my land," he shouted, stepping closer, his voice booming with a force he didn't know he had. Cal's smirk vanished entirely. His eyes darted between Joe's unrelenting stance and the unpredictable storm around them. Finally, he spat on the ground, signaling to his men. "We'll be back," he said coldly. "And next time, no games." Joe didn't lower the gun until the truck's taillights disappeared into the rain. His hands shook, and his breath came in short gasps as he turned back to the barn. Rusty was drenched in sweat, his sides heaving as he pawed at the ground. Joe stepped inside, placing a firm hand on the horse's neck. "It's over," he whispered, though he knew it wasn't. This wasn't a victory. It was a warning. Cal would be back, and Joe had no idea how long he could keep fighting. As the storm subsided, the quiet brought no peace. Joe was left with a single question burning in his mind. How far would he have to go to keep Rusty safe? The morning after the storm was eerily quiet. The air felt heavy, and the ground was littered with broken branches and debris. Joe stood in the barn, watching Rusty move nervously in his stall. The horse was still shaken, his muscles tense and his ears twitching at every sound. Joe ran a hand down Rusty's neck, his voice low and steady. "We've got to be ready, boy," he murmured. "They'll be back. And next time, they won't stop at threats." At breakfast, Clara's silence spoke louder than words. She finally set her coffee cup down with a sharp clink. "Joe, this has gone too far," she said, her voice trembling. "What are you going to do when they come back? Stand there with that old shotgun and hope they walk away again?" Joe didn't answer right away. He stared at the steaming mug in his hands, his mind racing. "I'll find a way," he said quietly, though even he wasn't sure what that meant. Clara shook her head, frustration breaking through her worry. "You've got more than just that horse to protect. Think about us, Joe. Think about your family." Joe spent the day working on the paddock fence, his hands moving on autopilot as his thoughts spiraled. The weight of Cal's threat hung over him like a storm cloud. Every car that passed the farm sent a jolt of fear through him. He knew Clara was right. He couldn't hold them off forever. But the idea of giving Rusty up felt like surrendering a piece of himself. That horse had survived so much already, and now Joe felt an unshakable responsibility to protect him, no matter the cost. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Joe's mind was made up. He'd reach out to the only person he could think of who might help, Earl Thompson, an old friend and former rodeo rider who lived a few towns over. Earl knew horses like no one else, and if anyone could help Joe train Rusty into something Cal couldn't ignore, something undeniable, it was him. That night, Joe picked up the phone, his fingers shaking as he dialed the number. When Earl's gruff voice answered on the other end, Joe wasted no time. "I need your help," he said. "It's about a horse." The next morning, Earl pulled up in a battered truck, his face weathered but kind. He stepped out, taking in the sight of Rusty with a slow nod. "He's got fire in him," Earl said, his voice low and approving. "But fire's nothing without control." Joe explained everything: Cal's threats, the auction, the scars Rusty carried from his past. Earl listened without interruption, his expression unreadable. When Joe finished, Earl clapped a hand on his shoulder. "We've got work to do," he said simply. Joe felt the first flicker of hope in days, but it came with a price. This fight was far from over. With Earl's arrival, Joe had a plan. But would it be enough to outsmart a man like Cal Whitmore, who wouldn't stop until Rusty was his again? Earl wasted no time. From the moment the sun rose, he and Joe were out in the paddock with Rusty. Earl's sharp eyes missed nothing, and his deep, gravelly voice carried commands that Rusty struggled to understand at first. The horse balked, bucked, and fought against the reins, his fear and mistrust bubbling to the surface. Earl didn't flinch. "He's been broken before," Earl muttered, adjusting the lead rope. "That kind of pain doesn't leave easy. But if he's still got fight in him, we can use that." Joe watched silently, his hands clenched at his sides, as Rusty's wild energy clashed with Earl's calm persistence. The first breakthrough came late on the second day. Earl had set up a makeshift course in the pasture, with barrels and poles to test Rusty's agility and focus. For hours, the horse resisted, stopping short or skirting around the obstacles. But then, as if a switch flipped, Rusty began to trust the guidance. He wove through the barrels with a sudden grace that made Joe's breath catch. "There it is," Earl said, nodding. "That fire I was talking about." Joe felt a swell of pride, but it was quickly tempered by the weight of what lay ahead. This wasn't just about training Rusty. It was about proving that the horse was worth more than Cal could ever claim. In the evenings, Joe and Earl sat on the porch, sharing quiet moments over cups of bitter coffee. Earl spoke of his rodeo days, of horses he'd trained and the lessons they'd taught him. But one night, as the crickets chirped and the moon hung low, Earl's tone grew serious. "Cal Whitmore isn't just a man with money," he said. "He's got connections. And people like him don't fight fair." Joe nodded, his jaw tightening. "I'm not backing down," he said, his voice low but steady. Earl leaned back, studying him. "Good. Just make sure you're ready when he comes." The progress Rusty made in those days was undeniable. His once shaky steps turned into confident strides, and the light in his eyes grew brighter with every challenge he overcame. But even as Joe felt hope returning, A shadow lingered in the back of his mind. Cal hadn't shown up again. Not yet. Joe knew it was only a matter of time before the man made good on his threat. And when he did, Joe would need more than just Rusty's training. He would need to summon every ounce of courage and resilience he had left. As Rusty grew stronger, so did Joe's resolve, but Cal's silence was a warning. The storm wasn't over. It was only gathering strength. Rusty was a different horse now. His muscles were stronger, his steps confident, and his eyes held a spark of life Joe had never seen before. Earl watched from the fence, nodding in quiet approval. "He's ready," Earl said. "You've turned him into a real contender, Joe." But Joe didn't feel the relief he expected. Cal Whitmore wasn't the kind of man to back down quietly. Rusty's transformation was a triumph, but it also made him an even bigger target. Joe's grip on the fence tightened. "He's not just a contender. He's mine," he said firmly, more to himself than to Earl. That evening, Clara approached Joe with another letter in her hands, her face heavy with concern. "It's from the bank," she said softly, handing it to him. Joe unfolded the paper and read the familiar, gut-wrenching words, "Final notice." He swallowed hard and glanced at her. "I'll fix this," he said, trying to sound confident, though the weight of his words threatened to crush him. Clara nodded, but her eyes flickered to Rusty in the paddock. "I hope you're right," she whispered, and walked back toward the house. As night fell, Joe sat quietly in the barn, stroking Rusty's mane. The horse stood calmly beside him, his trust in Joe unwavering now. "We've come too far to lose this fight," Joe whispered. But in his heart, he knew that Cal Whitmore wasn't done. Men like him never walked away from what they wanted. Joe's mind raced with what little he could do if Cal returned, and he knew that return was inevitable. Just before dawn, the rumble of engines shattered the stillness. Joe's heart clenched as he rose from the bale of hay. He moved to the barn door and froze. 2 trucks rolled into the driveway, their headlights piercing the early morning fog. Joe could make out silhouettes as the doors slammed shut. It was Cal. And this time, he wasn't alone. Joe tightened his fists, his pulse pounding in his ears. The moment he'd been dreading was here, and now he had to decide. How far was he willing to go to protect everything that mattered? Joe stood in the doorway of the barn, the early morning chill biting at his skin. His breath was shallow, his fists clenched. In the driveway, Cal Whitmore stepped out of his black truck, flanked by 3 ranch hands. Their boots crunched against the gravel as they approached, carrying an air of quiet menace. Joe's heart pounded, but he didn't move. Behind him, Rusty shuffled in his stall, sensing the tension. Cal stopped a few feet from Joe, his smirk as sharp as a knife. "Mornin', Callahan," he drawled, adjusting his hat. "Figured I'd stop by and take what's rightfully mine." Joe stepped forward, blocking the entrance to the barn. "You've got no right to him," Joe snapped. "You gave him up at that auction, and I've done more for him in weeks than you ever did." Cal's smirk vanished, his expression darkening. "You think a few weeks of feed and some tricks in the paddock make him yours? You don't know how this works, Callahan. Men like you don't win." One of Cal's men moved toward the barn, but Joe raised the old shotgun, his hands steady despite the fear coursing through him. "Take one more step," Joe said, his voice low and firm, "and you'll find out how far I'm willing to go." The man froze, glancing back at Cal, who held up a hand. "Let's not get hasty," Cal said, his tone mocking. "I've got the paperwork." "You've got what? A failing farm? A horse you can't afford to keep?" Joe's grip tightened on the shotgun, his eyes blazing. "Rusty's not just a horse," he said. "He's proof. Proof that even something broken can be saved. Proof that there's still fight left in me. And if you think I'm gonna let you take him without one hell of a fight, you're dead wrong." For a long moment, the only sound was the wind rustling through the trees. Then, from behind Joe, The sound of hooves echoed on the barn floor. Rusty stepped into view, his head held high, his copper coat gleaming in the pale light. Cal stared at the horse, his expression shifting from anger to something that almost looked like regret. "Fine," Cal finally said, his voice cold. "Keep him. But you'd better pray that horse is worth it, Callahan." With that, he turned on his heel, motioning for his men to follow. The trucks roared to life, and in seconds, they were gone. Joe sank to his knees, the shotgun slipping from his hands. Rusty stood beside him, his soft breath warm against Joe's cheek. In that moment, the weight of everything, fear, exhaustion, relief, washed over him. "We did it, boy," Joe whispered, tears filling his eyes. "We held on." From that day forward, Joe and Rusty became inseparable. Rusty wasn't just a horse anymore. He was a symbol of resilience, a testament to what could be achieved when you refuse to give up. Together, they not only saved the farm but rebuilt something even stronger, a life worth fighting for.